Okay, let's jump straight in. Deuteronomy chapter 2 is basically this incredibly fascinating travelogue. It marks the ultimate turning point for the Israelites. It's the exact moment their long, seemingly endless holding pattern finally comes to an end, and their march toward their promised inheritance truly begins. Welcome to the Pardes channel. Today we explain Deuteronomy chapter 2 in a clear and simple way, step by step. Let's dive right into this. Here is the itinerary for our journey today. First, we'll cover the journey past Edom. Second, Moab, Ammon, and the giants. Third, crossing the Zered Valley. Fourth, defeating Sihon of Heshbon. Fifth, key ideas and clarifications. And finally, some practical life lessons. Section 1, the journey past Edom. So, to really understand verse 1, we have to remember where the Israelites are. They've been stuck in a holding pattern, right? They had turned back, setting out toward the desert along the route to the Red Sea, exactly as God had directed Moses, and for a really long time, they were just kind of making their way around the hill country of Mount Seir. But then everything changes. In verses 2 and 3, God speaks to Moses and says, "You have made your way around this hill country long enough, now turn north." This is a massive moment. In biblical Hebrew, that command to turn north, using the root word tzaphon, signals a definitive, powerful shift. After decades of aimless wandering, God is finally giving them the green light. They are advancing directly toward their promised inheritance. But here's the thing. Turning north means they have to pass through specific, inhabited territories, and God gives them some very strict rules of engagement. Verses 4 through 6 detail this whole sequence. They're about to pass through the territory of their brothers, the descendants of Esau who live in Seir. Now, God warns Moses that the people of Esau will be afraid of them, but the Israelites, they must be very, very careful. They are strictly commanded not to provoke them to war. And practically speaking, they're told to be good guests. They literally have to pay for the food they eat and the water they drink in silver. And this wasn't just a polite suggestion. It was a strict command to prevent pillaging and to establish Israel as a nation of laws and fairness, even toward potential adversaries. Plus, God reminds them in verse 7 that he has blessed them and watched over them for 40 years in that vast desert. They have lacked absolutely nothing, so they don't need to take anything by force. And here's the really crucial point underlying all these rules, coming directly from verse 5. God says, "I will not give you any of their land, not even enough to put your foot on. I have given Esau the hill country of Seir as his own." God actively honors his land grants to other nations. It's a key principle. The Israelites really need to understand that not all the land in the region is theirs for the taking. The territory of Seir belongs to Esau's descendants by divine decree, and that decree must be respected unconditionally. Section 2. Moab, Ammon, and giants. Now, what's really interesting about this next part of the journey is how perfectly God treats the next two nations. As the Israelites obey and travel past Edom, turning from the Araba road, they hit the borders of Moab and Ammon. When Israel approaches Moab, specifically the region of Ar, God says in verse 9, "Do not harass the Moabites or provoke them to war." And why? Because God has given Ar as a possession to the descendants of Lot. And later on in the chapter, down in verse 19, when they approach the Ammonites, the instruction is identical. Do not harass or provoke them, because their land is also a possession given to the descendants of Lot. So we see God consistently protecting the borders of the nations he has established. As Moses narrates this journey, the text actually pauses in verses 10 and 11 to give us some really fascinating historical background about who used to live in these lands. We learn about the Emites, or Emim. In Hebrew, Emim roughly translates to the terrifying ones or terrors. The text explains that these were a strong, numerous, and tall people who previously lived in the land of Moab. They were considered Rephaites, a term often associated with ancient, formidable giant clans, just like the famous Anakites. And you have to wonder, why does Moses include this little historical footnote? Well, it's for a very specific reason, to build Israel's faith. He's showing his audience that the Moabites had successfully displaced a terrifying people. The unspoken lesson is crystal clear here. If Moab could do it, Israel absolutely can too. And guess what? The exact same thing happened in Ammon. In verses 20 and 21, the text clarifies that the Ammonite territory was also considered a land of the Rephaites. The Ammonites actually called their giants the Zamzummites. The Hebrew root of this word sounds kind of like buzzing or mumbling, which probably refers to the strange, unintelligible language these imposing people spoke. But the critical plaintext point here is this. The Lord destroyed these buzzing giants from before the Ammonites, allowing them to drive the giants out and settle in their place. In fact, Moses lays out a clear timeline of how God has orchestrated all these regional shifts. Verses 12 and 22 remind us that the Horites originally lived in Seir. And here's a fun historical fact for you. The Hebrew word Hori simply means cave dwellers. It really shows how ancient peoples were named after their terrain. But God destroyed these cave dwellers from before the descendants of Esau, allowing Esau's descendants to drive them out and settle in their place. The profound, simple meaning here is that God is entirely sovereign over all territorial shifts. He helped other nations drive out strong enemies and giants. And this sets a direct, unshakable precedent for Israel. Just as God did this for Esau, Moab, and Ammon, he is fully capable of doing it for Israel in the land he promised them.
Section 3. Crossing the Zered Valley.
Moving forward in the journey, we reach verses 13 through 16. God issues a direct, monumental command. Now get up and cross the Zered Valley. To clarify the geography a bit, the Zered is a wadi, a ravine or seasonal riverbed that acted as a natural border. Crossing this physical boundary line signifies the definitive end of their long holding pattern in the wilderness. Moses states simply, "So we cross the valley." And verse 14 hits us with a staggering number, 38. 38 years had passed from the time they originally left Kadesh Barnea until this very moment crossing the Zered Valley. Just think about the sheer gravity of that wait for a second. An entire lifetime spent in the wilderness waiting for this exact step. Verses 14 through 16 explain the sad but necessary reason for this 38-year delay. During that time, the entire generation of fighting men who had rebelled against God, those who lacked faith and panicked after the incident with the 12 spies inspecting the land, had perished from the camp. God's hand was against them until they were completely eliminated, exactly as he had sworn to them. So, the crossing of the Zered Valley marks the definitive moment when the last of those fighting men had died. The slate is wiped clean, and the new generation is finally officially ready to move forward into their promise. Section 4. Defeating Sihon of Heshbon.
With the past generation gone and the boundaries of Edom, Moab, and Ammon peacefully respected, God gives the order in verse 24 to cross the Arnon Gorge. Now, this introduces a drastic shift in the narrative. They're no longer just passing by peacefully. God tells Moses he has given Sihon, the Amorite king of Heshbon, into his hands. But notice Israel's initial, measured approach in verses 26 through 29. Moses sends messengers from the desert of Kedemoth with an offer of peace. Israel's diplomatic approach is exactly how they treated Edom. They asked to pass through, they promised to stay strictly on the main road without turning left or right, and they offered to buy food and water for silver. But King Sihon's response? It's aggressive. He stubbornly refuses to let them pass through his country.
So why did Sihon refuse such a reasonable and peaceful offer? Well, verse 30 addresses this very simply. It says, "For the Lord your God had made his spirit stubborn and his heart obstinate in order to give him into your hands as he has now done." This actually echoes what God did with Pharaoh back in Egypt. God allowed a leader's inherent stubbornness to harden entirely into a tool for his ultimate plan. Because Sihon chose blind hostility, God used that exact stubbornness to bring about Sihon's total defeat and legally transfer his Amorite land to Israel.
The result is a complete and total victory. From verse 31 through 36, Moses describes how God delivered Sihon over to them. Israel conquered his land, capturing and destroying all his towns, from Aroer on the rim of the Arnon Gorge all the way to Gilead. Notice the phrasing used here. There was not a single town with walls too high for them. This directly negates the very thing the previous generation had feared 38 years prior. The giant walls that terrified the spies meant absolutely nothing against God's power. The Lord gave them all to Israel. But look closely at verse 37. Even in the momentum of this massive victory, Moses points out that Israel still faithfully obeyed God's boundary rules. They carefully stayed away from any land belonging to the Ammonites, including the course of the Jabbok River, exactly as God had commanded earlier.
Section 5. Key ideas and clarifications. Let's move to and see how this builds into our synthesis of the chapter's plain literal meaning. We've walked through the entire chapter, verse by verse, so what are the central takeaways of this explainer? First, God actively honors his land grants to other nations. Esau and Lot's descendants were given their lands by God, and Israel was commanded to respect those borders unconditionally. Second, that 38-year wait for the rebellious generation to pass away is officially over at the Zered Valley crossing. The slate is clean. Third, the historical parentheses about the Emim and Zamzummites prove that God drove out powerful, terrifying giants for other nations, providing absolute assurance that he will do the exact same for Israel. And finally, the defeat of the stubbornly hostile King Sihon was Israel's very first undeniable taste of taking their promised inheritance. Section 6. Practical Life Lessons. And this brilliantly illustrates that we don't just read this as ancient history. We look at this to see how we can apply these historical, step-by-step events to improve ourselves today. So what are the practical life lessons here? First, respect the boundaries and property of others. Even though Israel was a massive, powerful nation, they were commanded to humbly buy their water and respect Esau and Lot's borders. Second, trust in God's provision. God reminded them that for 40 years they lacked nothing. When we trust providence, we don't need to take from others out of fear. Third, recognize that God is in control of the big picture. He manages the rise and fall of nations and their borders, just as he did with the cave dwellers and the giants. We can totally trust his ultimate timing. Fourth, approach conflict with peace first. Even when facing a hostile nation like Sihon's, Israel's first instinct, directed by God, was to send messengers of peace. As we wrap up this chapter, it leaves us with a real challenging thought. If the creator of the universe is so meticulous about respecting the physical boundaries of others, how carefully are we respecting the emotional and relational boundaries in our own lives? Thank you for learning with us. If this helped you understand the chapter better, like, subscribe, and join us for the next chapter.